From walkouts and scary outbursts to surprising comebacks and plays, college football has everything that would get you on the edge of your seat. But after celebrating its 152nd year, there are some moments that have stood the test of time, such as the greatest play in the greatest championship game of all time. Who can forget the 2006 Rose Bowl play between USC and Texas? This match had pretty much all the makings of an unforgettable experience. The number 1 and number 2 teams had some of the biggest future NFL stars, and they faced off against each other in an intense match in the best football stadium out there. But the best moment, which made everyone lose their minds, was when Texas quarterback Vince Young made a heroic last-ditch attempt. With 19 seconds on the clock, Young took matters into his own hands. He first looked for an open receiver, but when he was unable to find one, he grabbed the ball in his hands and ran towards the end zone. He ran across the 4th and 5th from the 9-yard line. That's when everyone knew that the game was Texas's bag. Young's heroic feat landed Texas their 4th national championship title, and also ended USC's reign once and for all. USC had a 34-game winning streak behind them before this match, but after this game, they were reminded that anything could happen, and this cemented Vince Young's GOAT status in college football folklore. But in college football, not everyone gets their hero origin story. Some players just end up getting burnt out. Much like Marcus Dupree, who ended up quitting altogether. Marcus was one of the finest players that the world just lost along the way, and many still wonder what could have been had he just stayed. Marcus played for the Oklahoma Sooners, and pretty much set the college football scene on fire back in 1982. He was a highly sought-after and extensively recruited player, because of the speed, strength, and just overall talent that he had. But later on, he transferred from Oklahoma to the University of Southern Mississippi, and that's when things started to go south for the young player. Even though he had an amazing record at USM, he was still told he must sit out a whole season because he transferred in the middle of the season. With this disappointment, the mounting pressure, and the successive injuries he suffered, Marcus decided to quit and left during his sophomore year. That left a lot of people scratching their heads over why such a rising sensation who had everything in front of him take such a drastic step. But it was clear that the world of college football just didn't do it for Marcus. ABC Sports commentator Mark Connolly claimed that Marcus had all the tools, but it was only his circumstances that held him back from achieving NFL success. His head coach claimed that it was purely because of personal financial reasons that he quit. He wanted to do a job and support his family financially. But whatever made Marcus, it revealed the human side of sports that we fans often forget. And since we're talking about failures, why don't we go way back in 1916? I'm talking about the largest blowout in college football history. On October 7, 1916, Georgia Tech and Cumberland met in a game that turned out to be a washout of epic proportions. There were two things motivating Georgia Tech that day to give the best performance of their lifetimes. The head coach of Georgia Tech, John Heisman, wanted to run up the score for 2 years. And Georgia Tech also wanted revenge for when Cumberland beat them 22-0 in baseball that same year. And on top of that, Cumberland didn't really have that big of a motivation to play. Basically, that same year, Cumberland had discontinued their football program, but contractually they were still supposed to play. Whether they were expected to play good or bad wasn't really necessary. So what resulted in was a complete washout with Cumberland not even gaining a single yard. Well, whether that's still considered true or not is unclear, but one thing remains for certain, and that's Cumberland suffered the most humiliating defeat in college football history. With such humiliating losses, there are also some awe-inspiring moments in college football that remind you why this sport exists in the first place.
Laburn remains the tailback and moves to the left. Give goes to Laburn right up the middle. Touchdown, Marshall.
Like when Marshall Thundering Herd returned to play after a devastating plane crash. The world watched in wonder when Marshall Thundering Herd came to play in the 1971 season. Just a year before, the Southern Airways Flight 932 crashed and killed all 75 passengers. Amongst those passengers was the entire Marshall football team. All 37 members of the team passed in that devastating tragedy. This is still considered to be the worst single air tragedy in NCAA sports history. There are countless memorials, songs, and even a film adaptation on it. So when the 1971 varsity level season came around, many wondered if Marshall would compete at all. And that's when the resilience shown in sport peaked through the most. The NCAA allowed Marshall to include the incoming freshmen at the varsity level and allow them to play in the 1971 season. No one was rooting against Marshall on that season, and each match proved to be a really emotional one. The Marshall Thundering Herd ended up beating Xavier 15-13 in a really intense match that left everyone teary-eyed. During the final play of the game, Marshall was able to score on a 13-yard screen from Reggie Oliver to Tyler Gardner. This ended up making the match one of the most memorable and emotional matches in college football history.
November 14, 1970. After a game against East Carolina, the Marshall football team boarded a flight back home to West Virginia. The accident is the deadliest sports-related tragedy in American history.
And with such inspiring stories, there has to be a mention of the great Archie Griffin. Archie Griffin stuns the world by winning 2 Heisman trophies. The Ohio State running back carried his entire team on his back in 1974. The numbers will blow you away. During that season, Griffin carried the ball about 256 times. On top of that, he had picked up about 1,695 yards. And to wrap this up, he had managed to run to the end zone about 12 times. All of this earned him the Heisman Trophy, but that's not over. In the next season, Griffin had carried the ball about 262 times and covered about 1,450 yards. And on top of that, he had also scored about 4 touchdowns. This landed him the Heisman Trophy once again. This remains a historic feat, as he's the only player to win the trophy twice. And it looks unlikely that someone else will be breaking this record anytime soon. While college football has pushed many players like Griffin into the spotlight, it keeps changing as the times go and adding new terms, like when the NFL enforced its rule of forcing the players to wait 2 years. In 1989, the NFL made the historic decision of no longer requiring players to finish their collegiate eligibility in order to qualify for the NFL draft. What they simply did instead was allow the players to wait 2 years after their high school graduation before they could go on to play for the NFL. This meant that the players could go off to college and play there for 2 years, or they could just not join college and wait for their time to come. This was a very important turning point for the sport, because it meant that players could bypass their junior and senior years. And now, all we could do is wonder how amazing it would have been if we had had some of the best football stars for longer. Ah well, I could only dream. And those were some of the most memorable college football moments.